In 16th century Istanbul, inside Topkapi Palace's Imperial Harem, your life is controlled by the Sultan and the women above you. When you break a forbidden rule, guards can seize you, lock you away, and drag you before someone who decides your fate. And no, you don't need to commit some grand act of treason. Sometimes the offense is much smaller. You disobey an order. You sneak into a restricted room. You insult a senior woman. You fight with another servant. You carry a message you weren't supposed to carry. You get involved with the wrong man, and suddenly, your entire world shrinks to a locked door. The Ottoman Harem wasn't simply a room full of women waiting for the Sultan. It was a tightly controlled institution inside the palace, filled with enslaved women, servants, senior attendants, princes, eunuchs, royal mothers, and powerful favorites. At the top stood the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother. Below her were senior women, administrators, attendants, and enslaved girls, whose futures depended heavily on their usefulness, discipline, and connections. So when you broke a rule, you weren't arguing with one person. You were challenging an entire hierarchy. And the first punishment might be humiliation. You could be shouted at, beaten, confined, demoted, or removed from your position. For an enslaved woman, losing status wasn't just embarrassing. It could destroy whatever future you'd been building inside the palace. You hear the door open. Boots, then keys. The room suddenly goes quiet. You already know why they're there. Yeah, this gets ugly. There was no single Ottoman harem punishment code that automatically told everyone exactly what happened after every offense. Punishment depended on the period, the offense, your status, and, perhaps most importantly, who was willing to protect you. That last part mattered enormously, because palace justice was never just about rules. It was about power. If you were an obscure servant with nobody important behind you, a beating or confinement could be devastating. If you were a favored woman with powerful connections, the same offense might be handled very differently. That's the first cruel lesson of the harem. The rules weren't necessarily equal. Your first serious punishment could be physical. Discipline inside Ottoman institutions could include beating, and palace servants lived under strict authority. You weren't working in a modern workplace where you could complain to human resources. There was no human resources department. There was a palace, and the palace had guards. For an enslaved woman, refusing an order could have consequences because your legal and social position was fundamentally different from that of a free noblewoman. You belonged to the household. Your body, labor, movement, and future were controlled by people above you. And if you repeatedly caused trouble, you could lose the one thing that might eventually change your life, your position. Because here's the strange part. The harem wasn't necessarily designed to keep every woman trapped there forever. Successful enslaved women could receive training, rise through the hierarchy, and eventually leave the imperial household through marriage or other arrangements. So discipline wasn't only about punishment. It was about controlling the system that produced loyal servants and future elite households. Break the rules badly enough, and that future could disappear. You could be dismissed, transferred, removed from favor, or, depending on circumstances, sent away from the palace. For you, that could feel like being thrown out of the only world you knew. And then there was confinement. Imagine being locked into a room while everyone else continues their daily routine outside. You hear footsteps in the corridor, women whispering, doors opening, trays being carried past, then silence. Nobody explains when you're leaving. Nobody tells you whether the punishment will last a day or longer. God, imagine realizing nobody is coming. Confinement was especially frightening because the palace itself was a maze of controlled spaces. Where you could go mattered. Who you could see mattered. Who you could speak to mattered. And contact with men was particularly sensitive. The harem was guarded by eunuchs, especially the powerful chief black eunuch, who controlled access and administration. You couldn't simply wander into the Sultan's private quarters. You couldn't casually meet palace men. You couldn't treat royal privacy like a minor suggestion. A secret meeting could become a political problem. A message could become evidence. And a relationship could become a scandal. That's where things become much darker, because the harem was also a political environment. The women around the Sultan could influence appointments, marriages, access, information, and succession politics. So imagine you become close to the wrong person. You whisper something to another woman. She repeats it. That woman tells a senior attendant. The attendant tells an influential eunuch. And suddenly your private conversation isn't private anymore. Okay, that's insane. This is also why accusations could be dangerous. Not every accusation resulted in execution, and surviving records don't give us a neat list of punishments for every alleged offense. But palace politics could become deadly when questions of succession were involved. The best-known example isn't a woman being punished for breaking a household rule. It's the fate of women who became trapped inside the struggle for power itself. Take Hürrem Sultan. She entered the imperial household as an enslaved woman and eventually became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. Her rise transformed the political structure around the Sultan. But her relationship with Mahidevran Sultan became the subject of a famous conflict. Ottoman and later European accounts describe an altercation in which Mahidevran attacked Hürrem, reportedly scratching and beating her. The exact details are debated, and the surviving evidence doesn't give us a clean official punishment record afterward. But that's important, because it shows how quickly personal rivalry inside the palace could become something much larger. Hürrem wasn't just another woman. She became Sultan Suleiman's favorite, and eventually his legal wife. Mahidevran was the mother of Shehzad Mustafa, one of the most popular princes of the dynasty. Now you have two women connected to two competing centers of influence. One palace argument suddenly sits next to the question of succession. And that is when the harem stops looking like a secluded women's quarter and starts looking like what it really was, a political battlefield. Years later, another woman would demonstrate just how dangerous that battlefield could become. Kosem Sultan rose from an enslaved girl to become one of the most powerful figures in the Ottoman Empire. She served as a royal consort, became Valid Sultan, and twice acted as regent for young sultans. By the 17th century, she wasn't someone guards casually dragged away for misbehavior. She was the person other people feared. And that's the brutal contradiction of the harem. The same institution that could punish an insignificant enslaved girl could eventually produce a woman powerful enough to control imperial politics. But power never guaranteed safety forever. In 1651, Kosem became caught in a deadly struggle with her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, over control of the empire during the minority of Sultan Mehmed IV. The conflict ended with Kosem's assassination inside the palace. She was killed by members of the palace faction supporting Turhan. Accounts describe her being attacked and strangled in her own quarters. Jesus. The woman who had spent decades navigating the Ottoman power structure was ultimately destroyed by that same structure. Her death wasn't a punishment for sneaking into a forbidden corridor. It was something far bigger, a palace power struggle. And that is why the worst fate waiting for you wasn't necessarily the beating. It wasn't even confinement. It was becoming politically inconvenient. Because once you became dangerous to someone powerful, ordinary rules could become almost irrelevant. You might be accused. You might be isolated. Your allies might disappear. The people who used to smile at you might suddenly stop speaking, and the most frightening sound in the palace wouldn't be shouting. It would be silence. Imagine you're sitting alone at night. No celebration, no music, no gossip from the corridor. Then you hear footsteps, slow, measured. Several people. You look toward the door. The lock moves, the door opens, and you understand something terrifying. The punishment isn't always about what you did. Sometimes it's about who now wants you gone. That's the real darkness of the Ottoman harem. For the lowest-ranking women, punishment could mean physical discipline, confinement, demotion, dismissal, or losing the future they'd hoped to build. For powerful women, punishment could become political destruction, and in the most extreme palace struggles, it could end in murder. So when you hear someone say the harem was simply a luxurious place where women waited for the Sultan, remember the locked doors, remember the guards, remember the hierarchy, and remember Kosem Sultan lying dead inside the palace after decades of surviving everyone around her. Because in Topkapi, the most dangerous rule wasn't written on a wall. It was much simpler. Never forget who has the power to open your door, and who has the power to make sure it never opens again.